next day was later. A few inches later. Day 2, Day 3, Day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening. Several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day. 146 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. Epilogue. Several song-filled hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 75 years later. 2 hours later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 2 very boring minutes later. 3 hours later. 1 winner later. The following day. Meanwhile. Later. Just montage. Meanwhile. Back in the lowlands. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 hour later. 5 hours later. 2 days later. Later. In the void. Approximately 10 hours later. Early the next morning. 1 shift later. 2 weeks later. 11 minutes later. 5 minutes later. A lot of boring math later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. 1 long angry line later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning. Montage. The next morning. Many tic-tacs later. Flashback. End of flashback. The very next evening. 1 hour later. The next day. Later. 4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning. Moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later.
5 minutes later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next... the next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. Several days later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
6 months later.
Meanwhile,
5,000 celebrities later.
1 little boost to the surface later.
A few minutes later. 1 hour later. 5 million years later.
The next morning. Later that night. The next evening. 1 operation later. 1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later. Meanwhile, the next morning. Later. 1 hour later. 7 months later. The next Christmas. Several long days later. Many toys later. 12 sleepless hours later. The next morning. The next morning. Many frame building attempts later. Even more boat building attempts later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 1 nap later. Several days later. The next day. 3 weeks later. 5 minutes later. 2 weeks later. 20 minutes later. 2 hours later. 1 week later. 10 seconds later. Much later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. Several months later. A few moments later. 1 hour later. A few minutes later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later.
2,000 years later.
1 eternity later.